Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to another Sunday of Science and Spirituality. As indicated by the title of this video, it's going to be me versus modern day hysteria versus Richard Dawkins versus William Lane Craig.
Hey, welcome to Modern Day Hysteria. My name is James Coons, and with me today is Logan Morton. Logan Morton, just a reminder, if you haven't seen any of the other videos, he's a graduate student in philosophy. We watched this together and we said, hey, what kind of insights are we coming up with independently? And those would be the most interesting things to talk about in terms of what we thought was the most weird or questionable that Dawkins said in the video. We're going to cut this up into two pieces. In this video, we're going to talk about Dawkins basically trying to give reasons for thinking that religion is false or that it doesn't have evidence for it. So let's get started with the video.
To me, as a scientist, the main argument is a scientific one. I think that the hypothesis that the universe was created by a supernatural intelligence is a scientific hypothesis. It's a bad hypothesis, it's a false hypothesis, but it has to be judged on its scientific merits. The universe would be a very different kind of universe if there was a supernatural creative intelligence in it than if there wasn't.
Okay, Logan, so that first point we both independently thought, that's kind of weird. Why is he saying that theism is a hypothesis, a scientific hypothesis more so? So Logan, if you want to just quick share some of your thoughts on why that seemed weird to you.
I think he was probably just doing that to give himself more credibility. I mean, if he says it's a philosophical issue, he doesn't have a whole lot of credibility there. And if he says it's a scientific issue, we should care what he says because he's a scientist. But, I mean, like the weirdest thing is he calls it a scientific hypothesis. And then I guess the way he thinks you're testing this hypothesis is by considering what the world would look like if you had a super intelligent creator. And he says it would look different. So, I mean, my best guess there is he's alluding to the problem of evil or something. And so it seems pretty weird and wrong to say speculating about what kind of universe a god would create is doing science.
Right, yeah. So I had a similar thought, and you might also ask, like, well, he says it's about what you would expect given theism or atheism. And I would think, but how do you know what you would expect given atheism or theism? And I don't think that's something you find through science. I'm curious to know what kind of scientific papers have shown what you should expect the world to look like if theism is true or if atheism is true. That sounds like philosophy to me. And I think you're exactly right. He knows that he doesn't have the credibility in philosophy, even though that's where you should go as philosophy of religion for answers on questions like these, is what are those actual experts on the topic saying?
Well, I personally look at religion and philosophy as incomplete sciences. So they do go through steps of the scientific method, they just don't go through all the steps. Take religion, for example. Religion is basically faith in an unproven hypothesis. Keeping in mind, of course, that a hypothesis is an attempt to answer a question, and a hypothesis, at least in scientific methodology, needs to be put to the test. And religion does do prayer experiments. So where religion fails to be a complete science is that it doesn't update its findings in the face of new evidence. So if new evidence comes along that disproves the hypothesis they've formed their religion around, they actually will reject that evidence in favor of what they believe. Now, this, of course, is a secular interpretation of what religious people are doing. You know, I'm sure there's plenty of religious people who have the attitude of, oh, I'm not rejecting evidence in favor of what I believe. You know, I'm being objective, that sort of thing, right? But I'm sure that they can at least notice that other religions are doing this. And hopefully that helps open them up to the possibility that maybe that's kind of what they're doing too. But what really got me interested in doing this response to Modern Day Hysteria's video was the question about whether it makes sense that the universe we live in would have been created by a supernatural being. So Dawkins is apparently of the attitude that it doesn't make sense that the universe we live in would have been created by a supernatural being. We'd expect a different kind of universe if a supernatural being was behind its creation. Modern day hysteria, on the other hand, is of the attitude, well, how would you know what to expect if a supernatural being created the universe? Why couldn't this universe have been created by a supernatural being? Okay. Now I actually kind of agree with Dawkins here. I want to clarify, though. It's not that this universe couldn't have been created by a supernatural being. It's that we have no reason to think that it was. Scientific, like if we're using the most up-to-date scientific research on the subject, we have no reason to think that a supernatural being is behind it. And we do have certain expectations about what a supernatural being would do when we look at ancient mythology. So if we start looking at specific supernatural beings that people actually believe in, like the God of the Bible, for example, then we have certain expectations that we can get from the Bible. Okay, and let's face it, like, reality check, everyone. The universe we live in does not match up with the universe we see in the Bible or any other ancient myth. In the Bible, we do see the perpetuation of the understanding of the universe in a more narrow sense as heaven and earth. That's a relatively flat and disc-shaped earth, circumimposed by the dome of heaven, both of which are floating in a sea of primordial waters. That is, waters that existed prior to the creation of heaven and earth. Again, this is a commonly held understanding of the universe found across different cultures in antiquity. So in the Bible, the earth is flat. The universe was created over the course of only 6 days, with God then resting on the seventh. You have man being formed from the dust of the ground, woman being fashioned from a rib in the man's side. All this evidence we have for the evolution of man from earlier primates would seem to disagree with that. You have talking snakes and talking donkeys and talking trees in the Bible. You have Moses walks up to the sea and miraculously parts the waters. You have this guy Samson who has these superpowers associated with his hair. He gets his hair cut, he loses those superpowers. His hair grows back and he gets the powers back. Right? You have all this wild, outlandish stuff in the Bible that we just don't see in the real world. Okay, so there's this universe that we see depicted in the Bible that really is not matching up with the universe that we actually exist in.
Let's go to the next point.
So much of my argument is a scientific argument. There is no positive reason to believe in anything supernatural. If you look at all the reasons that have been offered, none of them stand up, none of them hold water.
I'm amazed at Dawkins' kind of overconfidence here, because for years he's been ducking a debate with William Lane Craig.
I'm aware that somewhere along the way Richard Dawkins refused to debate William Lane Craig, but somewhere else along the way since then he has actually debated William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig seemed to think that it would be so intolerable, so disagreeable, that we are doomed to death, that the universe is doomed to death. Somehow playing on the heartstrings, playing on the emotions. It's not nice to think that we're all going to die. It's not nice to think that the universe is going to die a heat death and that everything is going to come to an end. It's not nice to think that everything is meaningless. And therefore, somehow that must prove that there is purpose in the universe, that there is some sort of top-down supervising God.
And everybody knows in the apologetics world, whether they're Christians or atheists, that Craig is kind of the goose that laid the golden egg in apologetics debates, like verbal debates. Also, other atheists such as Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens have both talked about how Craig is a very respected debater.
My brothers and sisters and co-thinkers in the unbelieving community take him very seriously.
The one Christian apologist who seems to have put the fear of God into many of my fellow atheists.
So it might be a little bit easier to take Dawkins' word that these arguments for religion or God have failed, except he refuses to debate the most competent Christian debater.
Well, if William Lane Craig is the best you got, then you're kind of screwed. Let's go ahead and have a look at William Lane Craig's best arguments for God.
In my experience, I think there are quite a number of different arguments for the existence of God. Let me just list some of them that I've defended in my work. One would be the contingency argument that holds that God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists rather than nothing.
We don't need to explain why there's something instead of nothing. That's ridiculous. Nothing is an irrational concept. If by nothing we're referring to literally the complete absence of anything at all, including any abstract concept of something with the potential for change. If there was an absence of any potential for change, then there wouldn't have been any change, and thus we don't exist. Yet, here we are, existing. So there's always been something, or at least some kind of stuff. And no, that does not imply that there had to have been a God. There could have been other stuff in existence. Why does it gotta be God? It doesn't have to be God. Okay, in fact, the evidence available to us suggests that what has always existed is energy. Energy, as far as we know, cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed. It can only change. Okay? If it cannot be created, yet it exists, that would seem to imply it's always existed. Okay? And energy is everywhere. It's in everything. It's even in the vacuum of space, producing quantum fluctuations, elementary particles like quarks, which make up subatomic particles like protons and neutrons, which make up atoms, which make up molecules, which make up the compounds of matter. Okay, so we don't need God. There's no evidence for that. We've got energy. We know energy exists.
A second would be the Kalam cosmological argument, which argues that God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe at some time in the finite past. God brought the universe into being from nothing.
Oh, come on, that's insane. God brought the universe into being from nothing. That's a contradiction. You can't have both God and nothing simultaneously. That makes no sense. If there's literally nothing, if there's literally a complete absence of anything at all, that means there's no God present to create anything else. If there is a God who can create stuff, that's not nothing. That's something. A God is something. Okay, even the God of the Bible creates with the power of his voice. He's not creating from nothing. He says, let there be light, and then there's light. Let there be a firmament, and then there's a firmament. He speaks things into existence with the power of his voice. And how the hell is God did it supposed to be a better explanation than the Big Bang? We don't have any evidence for God. We do have evidence for an expanding universe.
A third argument would be the design argument, which holds that God is the best explanation for the remarkable fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for intelligent life.
Oh wow, what a great point. Why did that never occur to me? Obviously, there's gotta be a God if the initial conditions for the universe are so fine-tuned for intelligent life. I mean, it was right there in front of me the whole time. How these initial conditions have really fine-tuned the universe for intelligent life. I mean, just look at all the intelligent life that's crawling all over the moon. Just look at all the intelligent life that's crawling all over Mars. Just look at all the intelligent life all over Phobos and Deimos. What about all the intelligent life we see on Venus and Mercury and in the asteroid belt? What about all the intelligent life that we see on Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune and all their moons? What about all the intelligent life we see on Pluto and the other dwarf planets? What about all the intelligent life that we see from other star systems? Oh, that's right. It turns out we haven't seen intelligent life anywhere other than here on planet Earth, if you can even consider any of the life here on Earth all that intelligent. Now, I'm not saying that there's no other intelligent life out there. I wouldn't be surprised if there is. But the fact that it's so hard to come by does kind of demonstrate that the universe can't possibly be finely tuned for it. What the hell are you trying to pull, Bill Craig?
Another argument would be the moral argument, that God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world.
Objective moral values and duties? Are you guys noticing a pattern here where he makes a case for God based on a false presupposition? There's no such thing as objective morals, dude. Morals are always consistently, 100% of the time, arbitrary and subjective.
I would also think that the ontological argument for God's existence is a sound argument, which argues that the very possibility of God's existence implies his actuality, and that therefore, if God is even possible, it follows that God exists.
That is the stupidest argument I have ever heard. And once again, we have a false presupposition. This idea that God is possible. That's an arbitrary personal opinion. Okay, if someone's of the attitude that it's possible God might exist, that's just an opinion. Let's say that objectively God doesn't exist, okay? If objectively there is no God, then it doesn't matter if someone's of the opinion that God might exist.
And finally, as I said, I think we can know that God exists through personally experiencing him as a kind of properly basic belief, in the same way that I know that the external world exists or that the past is real. I can know that God exists in that same sort of immediate, non-inferential way.
Oh yeah, because I experience God all the time. What the hell, dude? These are some really bad arguments. Terrible. Absolute garbage. And yet, as far as Bill Craig is concerned, these are some of the best arguments for God. What? What? Oh my God.
All right, and back to the Dawkins clip.
We have, in the form of Darwinian evolution, we have a superb theory of why living things have come into being, why they are the way they are, why they look as though they've been designed, and they undoubtedly do look as though they've been designed. The illusion of design in living things is immensely powerful, and it's no wonder that until Darwin came along, almost everybody believed that it was created by a supernatural intelligence. But we now have Darwin. We now have Darwin and his successors. We now know how life came about. And the complexity and the beauty, the elegance and the illusion of design of life has always been by far the most powerful argument for the existence of supernatural gods, and that is completely blown out of the water.
So I want to address the actual argument that Dawkins is giving here, though. So first, just keep in mind that I don't think that the biological argument from design is the best argument for theism, and frankly, I've never even used it. I haven't really researched it, so I don't even know if it's that good. But I do have other arguments that I think are good for God's existence. So it's not like the theist would be in trouble if they didn't have this, especially because Dawkins last year himself admitted that this isn't the best argument that theists have going for them, and other atheists have said that as well. Most think it's the fine-tuning argument. Some might think it's the argument from consciousness, etc. But the point is, I'm not sure that evolution would actually neutralize this argument. And the reason is, it seems to assume from the start that God couldn't use evolution as a means for designing certain things.
Well, since you are a Christian, it does seem reasonable to think that the relevant God in question here is the God of the Bible, who created heaven and earth and plants and animals over the course of only 6 days. He created birds in the sky before creating any land-dwelling reptiles. He forms man from the dust of the ground. None of this really jives with the evolutionary process. So the God of the Bible demonstrably is not responsible for the evolutionary process. But hey, maybe there's some other God behind the evolutionary process. Let's talk about if that makes sense. Now, what some people do is they just kind of deify whatever it is that's responsible for setting in motion the formation of the universe, and thus whatever's fundamentally responsible for setting the stage for the evolutionary process. So basically they're just deifying space-time energy, as we discussed. That is fundamentally what's responsible for all this. So I've come across people who have said stuff like, energy is God, or God is energy. You'll hear them talk about divine energy. They're just deifying energy the way that people used to deify the sun or the moon or the river or the mountain or the wind, right? Don't get me wrong, I do think that energy is more worthy of deification than any of those other things, since it is actually responsible for bringing all this other stuff about. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily meet all the other criteria that we've set, the other expectations that we've put in place for the concept of God. So, for example, some people are of the attitude that God, by definition, must necessarily be all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. If the creator in question is not all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, then it's not God. But that's not necessarily a personal standard that I set. It really is going to depend on who you ask. Different people are going to have different attitudes about what criteria a creator has to meet in order to qualify as God. So for me personally, I would say that if we're going to consider space-time energy to be God, that space-time energy has to demonstrate that it is listening to our prayers and performing miraculous acts to help us out. And of course, it's not doing that. So I don't see any reason to deify this space-time energy. I don't even see any evidence for it being sentient. I think it's reasonable to expect evidence of sentience if we're going to deify it. It's of course capable of producing sentience. We see that in life forms, or sentient life forms. But what I'm talking about is sentience at every single little point in space, or at least evidence for a larger network producing a sort of collective consciousness or something like that. And we're just not, I'm just not seeing any evidence for that, okay? So I'm not seeing any justification for deifying this space-time energy, at least not with any of the criteria that I would personally set. And, again, different people are going to set different criteria, but what it comes down to is that if you want to justify this idea that space-time energy is God, you're really going to have to lower the standard, compared to the usual standards that are set for God. This being that supposedly answers our prayers and performs miraculous acts. It's all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, right? Those are some pretty high standards. You have to really significantly decrease those standards in order to justify this idea that God actually exists. Suffice it to say, whether or not it's possible that God is behind the evolutionary process kind of depends on what you even mean by God. Are you setting like really low standards to the point where God doesn't even need to display evidence of being a sentient being, or are you setting higher standards, along the lines of God must be all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, right? So if you have really low standards, then sure, it's possible that something that you might consider to be God is behind the evolutionary process. If you have really high standards for God, though, then it's pretty much demonstrable that no, God is not behind that. We have no reason to think so. But anyway, Modern Day Hysteria eventually uploaded a second video responding to the rest of the Dawkins video. Basically, Dawkins went on to talk about how, every now and then people have done good things because of their religious beliefs, but for the most part, religion has done more to harm the world than it has done to help it. In modern day, Hysteria seem to basically be of the attitude that, Dawkins isn't doing real science here. He doesn't, cite any actual statistics to substantiate his position. He's basically just talking out of his ass. Let me put it this way. The philosophical teachings of Christ are, in my personal opinion, actually pretty good. They don't go far enough, but they're pretty good. Christ taught things like, love thy neighbor. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And may the Lord's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, traditional conceptions of heaven, of course, are of a paradise, a place where there's no war, crime, poverty, starvation, slavery, overpopulation, pollution, or bigotry. So, if Christians actually put the philosophical teachings of Christ into practice, then the world would be a better place. But Christians aren't practicing a philosophy, are they? They're practicing religious belief. When I was a kid, I had all these classmates that would tell me that if I didn't believe everything in the Bible, that I'd burn in hell for all eternity. This, of course, is what their parents were telling them, okay? So, they believe things like Jesus is the Son of God, he's born of a virgin, he, died for the sins of humanity and resurrected. That's, of course, a really important belief amongst a lot of Christians, this idea that Jesus resurrected. So you have to admit, there's a lot of emphasis being placed on believing the wild, outlandish claims that are being made in the Bible that's actually distracting from the philosophical teachings of Christ. It's distracting from building heaven on earth. But to be fair, Christ didn't exactly provide a blueprint for how to implement heaven on earth, which is why I say his teachings don't really go far enough. And what it comes down to is that the religious method of just kind of believing wild, outlandish claims, that's not going to do anything to solve any of the world's problems. That's not progress, that's regress, okay? What might actually help us solve the world's problems is if we implement the scientific method, okay? If we apply the scientific method for social concern, we can address the world's problems at a more technical level. We can identify the root causes of the world's problems. And, basically, if we eliminate the conditions that generate those problems in the first place, then those problems will cease to exist. So rather than having religious figures in, positions of political authority, running things based on their own arbitrary opinions and personal biases, might be a better idea to go with science. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you all in the next one. So have a good one guys, and peace.